Today's reading from Isaiah is an excellent one to wrestle with what it means to be fragile, tender human beings in a world that has power and violence and all that sort of stuff around us. It begins with this identification that God has chosen a servant, and that servant is, God delights in that servant. That servant is going to bring justice into the world. And it doesn't tell us exactly what justice is, but you get a little bit of a sense because it says that the servant isn't going to cry out in the streets and be loud and boisterous and braggadocious. That servant, it says, is not going to break a tender reed or quench a dimly burning wick. So you start to get the sense that justice isn't about power, but about caring for the people that are tender and weak. Later on in the passage, it says that this servant is going to be a covenant and a light to the nations that will free people from the prisons and captivity and bring sight to the blind. So all built into the work of this servant seems to be that justice is to lift up those who are really struggling and on the downside of things, vulnerable. But we don't generally like to talk about vulnerability as people. I've been on a number of airplane flights, lots of them in my life. And before you take off, they have a safety presentation. They talk about flotation devices and seat belts and the oxygen masks. How many people pay attention to that? Yeah, I got a few hands. When I'm on the plane, there ain't a lot of people paying attention. I did have a lady once tell me that she paid attention so that it would be fresh in her mind if she needed that information. And I thought, that makes sense. So I pay attention. And if you pay attention, they tell you that you may get to an altitude where, and if the plane cabin were to depressurize, we wouldn't be able to breathe because we're fragile. And so they tell you to put on your mask, but you may have someone next to you whose situation is more vulnerable than yours. Say a toddler who doesn't understand those kind of directions yet or can't reach that mask or doesn't have the dexterity to put it on. And so they say, put yours on first and then help them. And it's a recognition that in that situation, all human beings would be vulnerable, but some more vulnerable than others. I've also sat next to people on a plane who were perfectly physically capable, but if that mask were to fall down, there was no way they were getting their own mask on, right? You could just tell that flight made them super anxious and afraid. And so there's a vulnerability there too that's not physical, and it's not, say, their situation exactly, but there's some mental, emotional capacity that in that place we can be vulnerable. And we see these things all around us. Physical vulnerability, it can be illness, it can be accidents, it can just be as we age or before we get old enough that we're still a little bit tender. The situational stuff we also see around us. People that live in cycles of poverty, where maybe both spouses work, but they can't afford the first and last month's rent and the deposit, so they live in rotating situations of a car or a hotel room that's way more expensive than you should pay for, your day-to-day housing. And they are just like one car failure or one health crisis away from real disaster. And there's a situational vulnerability there. I think of Puerto Rico. Right? You've had this hurricane and trying to recover and now earthquake, right? It's just more added to the vulnerability of human beings. Seniors in nursing homes that maybe don't have family close by or family that visits. And so they sit in a place of emotional vulnerability in that situation all the time. So there's physical, there's situational, and then there's just the stuff that we all have that emotionally, spiritually, any of that stuff that just makes us feel vulnerable. It can be, for some people, it's family. For some people, it's certain sorts of environments. There's people who won't walk into a church because of hurt that they have experienced. And there's a vulnerability to that they don't want to walk back into. So in all of these places of tenderness and all of these places of vulnerability, when we feel vulnerable, how do we respond? Take a step back, right? So sometimes we run away, right? You remove yourself from the situation. And I'm not saying any of these responses are good or bad, just this is what we do, right? When we feel vulnerable, we want to be safe, and so we remove ourselves. What's another thing we might do? Lash out. Fight back against that which makes us feel vulnerable. There's one kind of in between there too. I think of September 11th. Before that, we didn't feel maybe vulnerable as a nation, but then all of a sudden we were. And so the first thing we did, lots of people went to church, right? Go to some place where tenderness can be held. But then we hunkered down. We made new laws. We fortified airports. We started to do the things you do when you feel vulnerable to protect yourself. But then we lashed out and said, now we're going to go fight against those people that made us feel unsafe. And all of this gets wrapped up in our humanity. And it happens in our day to day. If someone says a sharp word to you and that makes you feel vulnerable, sometimes you snap right back with a sharp word. Sarcasm can do that same thing. Other people just shut down and walk away from conversations because they just can't be in that space. And all of this is just part of the tenderness of being human. And it's into that human tenderness that we hear this passage from Isaiah that said God is going to send a servant. And that servant is going to come and not break the people that are tender and not put out the lights of those who are struggling to find life. It's going to free those people that are captive. Now, it's easy to hear this passage because we do this all the time. We read these servant passages in Isaiah and go, oh, that's talking about Jesus. And Jesus fits all of the things. He is chosen by God, delights God. Jesus comes and indeed walks around and cares for widows and orphans and people that are sick, all of those situations that are vulnerable, right? And so it's easy to read this and think, Jesus. But today I want to not get to Jesus too fast. We'll come back to that. But Isaiah was written long before Jesus was around. And when Isaiah was written, they had a different servant in mind. The people had been taken away from Jerusalem and Israel. They had been taken into Babylon, the city, the temple, all torn down. Do you think they felt vulnerable? That opening hymn we sang today talked about by Babylon's river. There's a psalm that says the Babylonians are asking us to sing, but we can't. We have to hang up our instruments because we just don't have it, right? The wick was not burning bright. And so the people feel vulnerable, and into that vulnerability, if you read what leads up to this passage, God says, hey, there's all these idols out there. The Babylonians worshiped different gods. Some of the kings had worshiped idols and other gods. And God says to them, did any of those idols tell you what's going to happen? And it's kind of a rhetorical question. God says, no, they did not. At the end of our passage today, God says, I am the one that tells you new things. And I tell them to you before they happen. You think about Jesus when he tells the disciples, I'm going to die and be raised to new life. He tells them, and then it happens, right? This is how God works. And so in this passage, God says, I'm the one who tells you that stuff, not those idols. But in between, you've got this servant. Now, a couple of chapters later, we're told who that servant is, and that servant is Cyrus. Now, Cyrus was not a Jewish person. He was not a Hebrew. He was actually the king of Persia. And God says, Cyrus is my instrument that is going to be the one that frees my people. And so when you hear this passage from Isaiah, it's God saying, I chose Cyrus, I delight in Cyrus, and Cyrus is going to be the one that sets the captive free. Now, Cyrus was the king of Persia, and he did defeat the Babylonians and send the people of Israel, say, you can go back home now. So that did happen. The trick, though, is this dynamic between vulnerability and power. God could have said, Cyrus is strong and mighty, and I am sending him in with this great army, and he is going to destroy the Babylonians and use all of his strength and might that I have given him to conquer the world, and then you will be free. But that's not what God says. God says, no, I have chosen this servant, and he's not going to be loud and boisterous about the work I have called him to do. In fact, he's not going to break anything that's tender or put out any wick that is dimly burning. He is going to free people that are captive. The servant that God is sending is one that's going to lift up those whose situation is vulnerable and tender, not one who's going to use force and might. And this is a good thing for us to remember as we try to discern in the world what is of God, right? And as we try to discern that, a good hint is the thing that God tells us. And God tells us in this story that what is of God is that which lifts up and doesn't break the tender thing, that which doesn't put out that dimly burning wick, that which frees those that are captive. which then now brings us to Jesus, because Jesus fits all of those measures. And not only that, when Jesus goes to the cross, he's got divine power. When Pilate is interviewing him and asks him a question, they say, "You're a king." Jesus says, "Yeah, but not the kind you think. If I was the kind you think, my people would be fighting, but they're not. I'm a different kind of king," right? He's the kind of king that lifts up that which is tender and helps burn bright that which is dimly burning. And so Jesus goes to the cross, and on the cross, one of the other prisoners there says to him what? "Save us. You've got this power. Fight back. Get us out of this." And Jesus said, "No, that's not how this works." Jesus' strength comes in that moment of weakness on the cross, which means on the cross, he meets us in all of our human tenderness. And whether that's the physical vulnerability that we have, or it's those situations that people just can't get out of and are vulnerable all the time, or in the fears and mental things that we wrestle with, Jesus on the cross meets us in all of that. And in the resurrection says that none of that is the end. None of that is the final answer. So that this passage from Isaiah, then we kind of sit in between. We're not Cyrus, and we're not Jesus, but yet it invites us to be servants of God. And in inviting us to be servants of God, it invites us to do the same things. Not to break people that are tender. To find those whose wicks are burning dimly and not put them out, but encourage. To find people that are captive and free them. The trick, though, is we're all people, so we're all tender, and we're all vulnerable. Now, when we're on the airplane, and they don't say it just this way, but when they say, "Hey, guess what? You're all vulnerable." And if we get to a situation where that becomes very obvious and these oxygen masks fall down, what are you supposed to do? Put yours on first. The best part about this text is what happens, not what Cyrus is called to do, but what God is up to. There's a little bit at the beginning that said, "This is my servant." And then it says, God is the one that created everything. The heavens and spread out the earth. God is the one that gives us breath and spirit. And that means like physical breath, but also like the spirit, right? And we can breathe in spirit. God is the one that makes new things happen and proclaims that they will come. So when we think about who we are as the church, called to be servants of God, we can breathe in that same spirit, right? The spirit of grace and forgiveness, of love, and that is like the air that we thrive on as God's people. But then we live in a world that doesn't breathe that. We live in a world that is starved for love and starved for forgiveness and starved for that kind of grace oxygen. And the responses in that vulnerable world are often the lashing out and the hunkering down, and not those places of lifting up those who are tender. So as we gather in this place around these sacraments, right, of water, as we hear about Jesus' baptism, and then at the table, these two are like spiritual oxygen for us, so that we can have our masks put on and then go out into the world and help others that need it put their masks on, so that they too can breathe in this gift of grace. Now, we're not always there, right? But that's the part about where we're not alone in the church. We're a whole thing, so that on the days where I can't get my own mask on, you can help me. And on days that you can't get yours on, we can help you. And then we can all go out into the world breathing in that grace, so that we can share it with others and help the world to live in that space as well. Amen.